The stallion's scream cut through the noise of Wimslow Livestock Fairgrounds like a blade through canvas. Zephyrus reared onto his hind legs, iron shoes slashing at the gray morning air, and the three grooms holding his lead ropes scattered like startled hens. Someone's basket of eggs went flying into the mud. The horse came down hard, snapped the last rope clean from a groom's gloved hands, and stood there trembling, nostrils flared wide, eyes rolling white at the edges. Siobhan had seen frightened animals before. She had never seen one look this exhausted by his own fear. "That's enough. Get him back in the pen, for heaven's sake." The estate manager, a stout man named Pruitt, with a waistcoat straining over his belly, mopped his brow with a handkerchief already soaked through. He had been trying to auction the horse since sunrise, and three grooms now nursed bruised ribs and one a split lip for their trouble. "He's finished a man in Aldenford's own stables, they say," muttered a farmer near Siobhan, adjusting his cap. "Broke old Ferris's arm in 2 places just last month." "Then why bring him to market at all?" asked his companion. "Because the Duke wants rid of him. Doesn't matter what price. A horse that can't be ridden is worth less than the oats he eats." Siobhan pressed closer to the fence rail, ignoring the sharp smell of manure and crushed hay that hung over the fairgrounds. She had walked 4 miles from Keldon that morning, her father's old wool coat buttoned to her chin against the October chill, with exactly 5 pounds and 3 shillings sewn into the lining of her skirt. It was meant for flour, for lamp oil, for the roof repairs she'd been putting off since spring. It was meant for 100 sensible things. She was looking at none of them. She was looking at the horse. Up close, Zephyrus was a magnificent animal beneath all that terror. A deep bay with a black mane matted from sweat, 17 hands if he was an inch, with the kind of powerful, clean-lined build that spoke of careful breeding. But it was his eyes that held her, not wild, not truly vicious, just desperate, the way a creature looks when it has learned that every hand reaching toward it means pain. Right then, Pruitt raised his voice, addressing the thinning crowd with the weary tone of a man who had given up on dignity an hour ago. "The Duke of Aldenford's estate offers this stallion, Zephyrus, sired by champion stock, at whatever price will take him off our hands. Reserve is 5 pounds. 5 pounds only, and he's yours, along with whatever trouble comes with him." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Nobody stepped forward. A horse worth perhaps 200 pounds on breeding alone, going for 5, and still no takers, that told its own story clearly enough. 5 pounds, Pruitt repeated, already turning to gather his ledger, clearly expecting no answer at all. "Going then. I'll take him." The words left Siobhan's mouth before she had properly decided to speak them. Heads turned. Pruitt's eyebrows rose so high they nearly vanished beneath his hat brim. "You, miss?" "Me." She was already working at the hidden seam of her skirt, drawing out the folded notes with fingers that did not shake, whatever her heart was doing beneath her ribs. She pressed the money into Pruitt's startled hand before he could think better of the sale, before her own good sense could catch up with her and drag her back to reason. 5 pounds. You said the reserve was 5 pounds. "Miss, I don't think you understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly well." She had already climbed over the lowest rail of the pen, moving slow and unhurried, the way her father had taught her to move around any creature in pain. Behind her she heard Pruitt sputtering some warning about liability and estates and the folly of young women, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Zephyrus's ears pinned back the moment she entered his space. He tossed his great head, backing into the corner of the pen, muscles bunched and ready to bolt or strike. Siobhan did not reach for him. She did not speak to him in the coaxing, high-pitched voice most people used on frightened animals, the voice that only confirmed to a horse that everyone around him was as anxious as he was. Instead, she began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, 3 notes, repeated in a pattern that rose and fell like breathing, something her father had used on colts, too green for saddle, and horses too broken to trust a bridle again. She had heard him do it 1,000 times as a girl, sitting on the paddock fence with her chin on her knees, memorizing the sound Zephyrus's ears flicked toward her, just slightly, just once. She kept humming, taking one slow step, then another, angling her body sideways rather than facing him head-on, the way a threat would. The crowd along the fence had gone silent now, every eye fixed on the girl in the worn wool coat and the trembling giant of a horse in the center of the pen. His nostrils worked at the air, drawing in her scent. His great sides heaved once, twice, and then, impossibly, began to slow. By the time Siobhan reached his shoulder and laid her palm flat against his damp, quivering neck, the fairgrounds had gone so quiet she could hear the wind moving through the auction flags overhead. "There," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "There now. Nobody's going to hurt you again." She did not know yet how completely that promise would be tested. She only knew, as she led the calm stallion out through the gawking crowd toward the long walk home to Keldon, that whatever she had just bought for £5 was worth a great deal more than anyone at that market understood, including, perhaps, herself. The walk back to Keldon had taken the better part of 3 hours, Zephyrus matching his stride to hers as though he'd been doing it his whole life rather than minutes. Siobhan had expected him to balk at every cart that passed, every dog that barked from a cottage yard, but he simply walked, ears swiveling at the world with wary curiosity rather than terror. By the time they reached her father's old stable, hers now, though she still thought of it that way most mornings, dusk had settled over the fields, and her legs ached from the distance. She had not slept well that night. Some part of her kept waiting for a knock at the door, for Pruitt or some estate man to arrive and declare the sale a mistake, the horse still Aldenford property after all. No one came. When she rose before dawn the next morning and crossed the yard to the stable, her breath fogging in the cold, she found Zephyrus standing exactly where she'd left him, watching the door with an alertness that told her he hadn't slept much either. "Good morning to you too," she said, and his ears pricked toward her voice. The stable had been built by her father 20 years before, a modest, thatched structure with 4 stalls, only one of which had seen proper use since he'd left. It smelled of old hay and cedar shavings, and, faintly, of the leather oil he used to work into every strap and buckle by lamplight. She had kept his tools. She had kept everything, in fact, unable to bring herself to sell off the last pieces of a man the district had tried so hard to erase from memory. She approached Zephyrus slowly, the way she had at the fairgrounds, and let him lower his head to lip at her palm before she touched the halter buckled beneath his jaw. It was not the halter that concerned her. It was the bit still resting in his mouth, a heavy iron contraption with sharp shanks that dug cruelly into the soft flesh at the corners of his lips whenever he so much as swallowed. "No wonder," she murmured, running her fingers along the raw, chafed skin she found there. "No wonder you fought them." She worked the bridle free with careful, unhurried movements, speaking to him in a low, steady voice the entire time, narrating each small motion before she made it so nothing came as a surprise. When the iron finally slid from his mouth, Zephyrus shuddered from nose to tail, a full-body release of tension that nearly buckled his knees. He pressed his face against her shoulder for a long moment, and Siobhan felt something tighten painfully in her chest. "They never once asked why you were fighting," she said quietly. "Only ever asked why you wouldn't stop." From the tack room she retrieved a soft leather noseband, one her father had fashioned himself for a mare too sensitive for conventional bits, a piece of equipment so old-fashioned that most modern trainers dismissed it as useless for anything. She fitted it carefully, checking the fit against his jaw, adjusting the buckle twice before she was satisfied it sat without pressure anywhere near the wounds. The change in him was immediate. His head, which had hung low and guarded since she'd bought him, came up. His ears, pinned flat more often than not, softened and turned toward her with something that looked almost like interest. "Now," she said, stepping back into the center of the small paddock behind the stable, "let's see what you actually know, once nobody's hurting you to make you show it." She began with groundwork, the exercises her father had drilled into her from the time she was old enough to hold a lead rope steady. She asked Zephyrus to walk a slow circle around her, using nothing but her body position and the soft, rhythmic sound she'd used at the fairgrounds, a language of pressure and release rather than force. He balked at first, uncertain, testing whether this too would end in pain. When it didn't, when she simply waited, patient and unbothered, letting him find his own way to the answer, he settled into the exercise with a focus that startled her. By mid-morning, he was following her voice commands to halt, to turn, to slow his pace, and lengthen it again, all without a lead rope in her hand. She stood in the center of the paddock and watched him move around her in flawless, unhurried circles, his powerful body finally free to simply be a horse rather than a battleground, and felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "You were never dangerous," she said, half to him and half to the empty morning air. "You were only ever in pain." It struck her then, watching him, how closely his fear mirrored something she recognized in herself, the way a person could be labeled difficult, unmanageable, simply for reacting honestly to treatment nobody else was willing to name as cruel. Her father had understood horses that way his entire life, and it had cost him everything the district once respected him for. She wondered, not for the first time, whether that was the true reason she'd stepped forward at the auction without a second thought for her own £5. By the time the sun stood high overhead, Zephyrus had eaten calmly from her hand, allowed her to run a soft brush along his flanks without flinching, and stood quietly while she checked each of his hooves in turn. He was, she thought, watching him doze in a patch of thin autumn sunlight near the paddock fence, nothing at all like the beast the fairgrounds had described. He was simply waiting, she realized, for someone patient enough to ask the right questions instead of demanding the right answers. She had no way of knowing yet that word of a horse, thought unrideable, now standing calm and obedient in a poor woman's paddock, would not stay confined to Keldon for long, or that among those who would eventually hear of it, one man in particular would take the news very badly indeed. By the fourth day, Siobhan's small store of oats had run dangerously low, and Zephyrus's appetite showed no signs of being satisfied by hay alone. She counted out what coin remained after the fairground purchase. Precious little, most of it now owed for grain, and set off on foot for Oakhaven Village, 3 miles east along the river road, with an empty sack folded under her arm. The village square was busy with the ordinary business of a market afternoon. Farmers haggled over the last of the autumn cabbages. A tinker sharpened knives outside the smithy, and somewhere a fiddle scraped out a tune nobody seemed to be dancing to. Siobhan kept her head down and moved directly toward the feed merchant's stall, hoping to complete her business and be gone before anyone thought to ask why a poor widow's daughter needed enough oats to feed a horse the size of a small barn. She had nearly finished tying the sack shut when a shadow fell across her hands. Well now, if it isn't the girl who bought Aldenford's monster for £5. She did not need to look up to know the voice belonged to Thaddeus. She had heard him described often enough by the fairground gossips, the Duke's head trainer, a man well regarded in certain circles for his firm hand with difficult animals, and well feared in others for exactly the same reason. When she did lift her eyes, she found him exactly as described, tall, lean, dressed in the fine dark coat of a man who considered himself several ranks above the company he currently kept, his boots polished to a shine that suggested he had never once mucked out a stall himself. "I bought a horse," she said evenly, cinching the last knot in her sack. "I wasn't aware that was cause for comment." "It's cause for concern, is what it is." Thaddeus folded his arms, looking her over with the particular condescension of a man who had already decided she was beneath serious conversation. "That animal has broken bones, broken spirits, more like among men twice your size and 3 times your experience. You've bought yourself a death sentence, girl, whatever price you paid for it." A few nearby stallholders had slowed their business to listen, though they pretended otherwise. Siobhan felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to anger, carefully banked. "He's eating from my hand," she said. "He stood quiet for a full hoof trim yesterday morning. I'd hardly call that broken." Thaddeus laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Tricks, he's fooled better trainers than you before he's put them in the dirt. That horse needs a firm hand and a proper bit, not whatever nonsense you've got him wearing now. I trained him myself for 8 months. I know precisely what he is." "Do you?" Siobhan met his eyes directly, something she suspected few people in his employment dared do. "Then perhaps you can explain the scarring at the corners of his mouth, or why he flinched at the sight of a crop before I'd so much as raised my hand." "A horse that's simply dangerous doesn't carry marks like that, Mr. Thaddeus. A horse that's been mishandled does." The trainer's expression flickered, just briefly, before settling back into contempt. "You'd lecture me on handling, a girl who's likely never trained anything larger than a barn cat." "My father trained horses for the Duke of Aldenford's own grandfather," she said, and watched the words land somewhere behind his eyes, though he gave no outward sign of recognizing the name she'd carefully not spoken. "I learned from him before I learned my letters. I know the difference between a horse that fights because he's vicious and a horse that fights because every hand that's touched him has taught him pain comes next. Zephyrus is the second kind. If you trained him for 8 months and never once considered that, then I'd wonder whose failure this truly is." For a moment, Thaddeus said nothing at all, and Siobhan wondered if she had finally pushed too far, said too plainly what half of Oakhaven likely whispered about the estate's harsh-handed trainer behind closed doors. His jaw tightened, a muscle worked along his cheek. "You'll ruin yourself," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier mockery and replaced with something colder. "That horse will put you in the ground the moment you let your guard down, and when he does, don't imagine anyone at Aldenford will trouble themselves over a stableless girl who couldn't leave well enough alone." "I'll take my chances," Siobhan said, hefting the sack of oats onto her shoulder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thaddeus." She walked away without looking back, though she felt his eyes on her the entire length of the square, and did not let out the breath she'd been holding until she'd turned the corner past the smithy and the market noise faded behind her. It was only once she was well onto the river road, the sack of oats growing heavier with every mile, that the shake finally reached her hands. She had spoken more boldly to a stranger than she had to anyone in years, and worse, She had spoken about her father aloud, invoked his name and his old position without meaning to, in a village where that name still carried complicated weight. She thought of Thaddeus's parting words the rest of the walk home, turning them over uneasily. He had not sounded merely irritated by her purchase. He had sounded, beneath the scorn, almost frightened of what her success with Zephyrus might mean, as though a 5-pound horse, behaving gently in a poor girl's paddock, threatened something far larger than his professional pride. She did not yet understand what that something was. But by the time Keldon's crooked chimney came into view against the darkening sky, she had made up her mind to watch her back all the same. 2 days passed quietly, and Siobhan let them. Thaddeus's warning sat uneasily at the back of her mind, but no cart came rattling up the lane, no estate men appeared at her gate, and by the 6th morning she had begun to wonder if the whole encounter had simply been the bluster of a proud man nursing a bruised ego. Zephyrus, at least, showed no sign of noticing her worry. He met her each morning at the paddock rail with his ears forward, waiting. He had settled remarkably in less than a week. The wariness that once tightened every line of his body had eased into something closer to trust, though she was careful not to mistake it for anything permanent. Trust, her father used to say, was rebuilt one honest moment at a time, and undone by a single dishonest one. She meant to be careful with every moment she had with this horse. That morning, she decided it was time to test him properly under saddle, not in the confines of the paddock, where he already knew every fence post and familiar smell, but somewhere new, somewhere his instincts would have to work alongside his training rather than simply following the shape of routine. She chose Bramblewood, a stretch of quiet woodland a mile from her cottage, where a wide grassy clearing opened between old oaks and the ground stayed soft and forgiving underfoot. She saddled him with care, checking the girth twice, running her hand beneath every strap to be certain nothing pinched. He stood patiently through the process, only flicking an ear when she settled her weight into the stirrup, and even then he simply turned his head to watch her mount, rather than shying away. "Easy now," she murmured, gathering the reins loosely, more habit than necessity, given how lightly she meant to use them. "Just you and me. No one watching, no one keeping score." They walked the perimeter of the clearing first, Zephyrus's ears swiveling at birdsong and the rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth, but his stride stayed even and unhurried beneath her. She asked for a trot next, using only the faintest pressure of her calf, and felt him respond instantly, his powerful gait smoothing beneath her into something almost effortless. It was when she asked for a canter that she understood, with a jolt that stole the breath from her chest, exactly what she was sitting on. Zephyrus did not simply canter. He moved in a way she had only ever seen described in her father's old training journals, a cadence so balanced and self-collected that he seemed to carry himself rather than being carried, each stride precise enough to place a hoof within an inch of where he intended, without so much as a glance downward. She had not asked for this. She had given no cue for it. It was simply in him, waiting. She slowed him to a walk, heart hammering, and sat very still in the saddle for a long moment. "Where did you learn that?" she said softly, though she already suspected she knew. Her father had spoken of it only rarely, and always with a strange, wistful pride buried beneath careful modesty, a style of riding he'd developed himself over decades in Aldenford stables, built on subtle weight shifts and breath rather than rein and heel, a method he'd used to train the finest horses the estate had ever produced before his sudden dismissal put an end to it all. He had called it, when he spoke of it at all, simply the quiet way. She had assumed, all these years, that the technique had left Aldenford's stables along with him. But Zephyrus was young, too young to have been trained by her father directly, which meant someone else had taught him this, whether they'd meant to or understood what they were teaching, or whether the movement itself had simply been passed down through bloodline and habit from horses her father once trained decades before, echoing forward into a colt who'd never met him. She thought of the estate's other horses, the ones bred from the same old lines her father had once overseen. She thought of Thaddeus's insistence that he alone understood this animal, and the harsh iron bit he'd used to force compliance from a creature who, it now seemed clear, had never needed force at all, only the patience to let his instincts surface on their own terms. "You're not what they think you are," she said, leaning forward to rest her hand briefly against his warm neck. "You're what my father spent his whole life trying to build, and nobody at that estate has any idea what they nearly threw away." She rode him through the clearing twice more, testing halts and turns and the smooth, controlled side pass her father had once demonstrated for her as a girl, delighted each time by how readily Zephyrus offered the movement, as though he'd simply been waiting his whole life for someone to finally ask correctly. By the time she turned him back toward home, the midday sun had climbed high overhead, and her arms ached pleasantly from the effort of holding herself as still and balanced as the ride demanded. She did not know, guiding Zephyrus back along the narrow woodland path, that a hunting party from a neighboring estate had passed within sight of the clearing not 20 minutes earlier, or that idle talk of a girl riding the Duke of Aldenford's supposedly unrideable stallion with startling, effortless grace would reach ears far beyond Oakhaven's market square before the week was out. She knew only that something in her chest had settled into place for the first time since her father's disgrace, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she and Zephyrus together had already proven something no one in the district had thought possible. It would not be long before that proof demanded to be tested in front of the very man who had cast the horse, and years before him, her father, aside. The knock came on the morning of the 8th day, though it was not a knock at all. It was the sound of hooves on the lane, several sets, moving at a brisk trot toward her cottage. Siobhan set down the bucket she'd been carrying and stepped to the edge of the yard, shading her eyes against the pale morning sun. 3 riders approached, liveried in Aldenford's deep green, and at their center rode a man she did not need introduction to recognize. He sat his horse with the easy authority of someone born to command a room simply by entering it, dressed in a dark riding coat cut far finer than anything Oakhaven's tailors could manage, his graying hair swept back beneath a low hat. The Duke of Aldenford had the bearing of a man rarely questioned and even more rarely defied. He did not come to her gate. He stopped at the estate boundary, a low stone wall that marked the edge of Aldenford land, a quarter-mile from her own paddock, and one of his outriders called across the field for her to approach. Siobhan's pulse quickened, though she kept her steps unhurried as she crossed the grass toward him, wiping her hands on her apron as she went. Zephyrus lifted his head from the paddock behind her and watched with obvious interest, ears pricked toward the visitors. "You're the girl who purchased my stallion," the Duke said, without preamble, once she stood before him. It was not a question. "I am, Your Grace." She dipped a small, proper curtsy, though something in her refused to lower her eyes entirely. "Siobhan, of Keldon. My head trainer tells me you've made claims about the animal's temperament that strain credulity, that he's grown gentle in a week under your hand, when 8 months of skilled instruction under my own stables achieved nothing but broken bones and ruined tack." His gaze moved past her, toward the paddock, where Zephyrus stood watching the exchange, with far more calm than his reputation suggested he was capable of. "I find that difficult to believe. Then I'd invite your grace to judge for himself, rather than take Mr. Thaddeus's word for it," Siobhan said, and felt, rather than saw, one of the outriders shift uncomfortably in his saddle at her boldness. The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly, though whether at her nerve or her offer, she couldn't tell. After a long moment, he swung down from his own mount and handed the reins to the nearest rider, stepping toward the low wall that separated Aldenford's boundary from her family's modest strip of land. "Show me, then." She fetched Zephyrus's halter from the paddock post and led him out, saddled lightly, into the open field beside the wall, where the Duke could observe, without trespassing onto land that was, however small, still legally her own. She mounted without ceremony, settled her weight, and asked Zephyrus for a walk. He moved beneath her, exactly as he had in Bramblewood, smooth, attentive, responsive to the faintest shift of her seat, rather than any harsh cue. She guided him through a slow circle, then asked for a halt, so precise his hooves seemed to freeze mid-stride, and finally, holding her breath slightly, asked for the side pass her father had taught her years before, watching Zephyrus step sideways in perfect, unhurried rhythm without a single misstep. The Duke said nothing for a long moment. When Siobhan finally dared glance toward him, she found his expression had shifted from skepticism into something far more complicated, a kind of stunned recognition that seemed, briefly, to age him. "Where did you learn that movement?" he said quietly. "My father taught me, Your Grace." She kept her voice steady, though her heart had begun to pound. "He trained horses for this estate himself, some years ago." Something flickered across the Duke's face. Not quite recognition, but close to it, as though a name hovered just out of reach. He did not ask for it, and she did not offer it, some instinct warning her the moment wasn't yet right to press further. "Whatever method that is," he said instead, recovering his composure, "it should not work. 8 months of trained handlers couldn't manage a fraction of what you've shown me in the space of a few minutes." His eyes narrowed slightly, pride visibly warring with genuine astonishment. "I don't care for being made a fool of, Miss Siobhan, nor for having my own trainer's competence called into question by village gossip. I've made no claims to Your Grace beyond what you've just witnessed with your own eyes." "No." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression hardened into resolve. "But others have begun talking, and talk of this kind reaches uncomfortable places. The Grand Autumn Exhibition takes place at Highfield in 6 days' time. Half the county's gentry will attend, along with breeders and buyers from as far as the coast. I intend for you to bring that horse and demonstrate, publicly, precisely what you've shown me here today." Siobhan felt her stomach drop. "Your Grace, I've no experience with exhibitions of that kind." "I've never—" "Then you'll gain it quickly, or you'll fail quietly, and confirm what every trainer in my employ already believes about that animal." His tone brooked no argument, though there was something beneath it, some flicker of genuine curiosity, he seemed unwilling to fully show. "If you're right, Miss Siobhan, you'll prove something my own stables have failed to manage in 8 months. If you're wrong, you'll lose nothing you haven't already risked by buying a horse everyone warned you would end you." He remounted before she could formulate a proper reply, gathering his reins with the finality of a man accustomed to ending conversations on his own terms. 6 days, he said, and turned his horse back toward the estate road, his outriders falling into formation behind him without a backward glance. Siobhan stood in the field beside Zephyrus long after the sound of hooves had faded, one hand resting against his warm neck, her mind already racing through everything. 6 days could not possibly be enough time to prepare. The 6 days that followed passed in a blur of practice and worry. Siobhan rose before dawn each morning to work Zephyrus through every movement she could remember from her father's old lessons, refining what already came naturally to him and testing his patience with the kind of crowd noise and commotion he'd likely face at Highfield. She banged pots near the paddock fence to accustom him to sudden sound. She draped bright cloth over the gateposts to test his tolerance for unfamiliar color and movement. Each time, he startled only briefly before settling, watching her with an expression that seemed more and more like trust freely given rather than obedience forced. By the 10th night, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, and she fell asleep in the chair by her cottage fire, without meaning to, a half-mended bridle still in her lap. She woke to Zephyrus screaming. It was not the terrified sound she'd heard at the fairgrounds, but something sharper, more alarmed, cutting through the darkness with an urgency that had her on her feet and out the door before her mind had properly caught up with her body. She grabbed the lantern from its hook by habit alone, fingers fumbling with the flint in the cold, and ran barefoot across the yard toward the stable, her nightdress catching against brambles she didn't feel. Zephyrus. A shape moved near the tack room door. Low, quick, a figure ducking away from the stable's side entrance the moment her lantern light swung toward it. She caught only a glimpse before it vanished over the low fence at the edge of her property and into the darkness of the lane beyond, moving with the practiced haste of someone who knew exactly how much time they had and had run out of it. She did not chase. Zephyrus mattered more than catching whoever had fled, and his continued cries drew her straight into the stable, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. He stood in his stall trembling, ears pinned flat, sides heaving, but a quick check with trembling hands found no wound, nothing to explain the sound beyond fright itself. She spoke to him low and steady, the same 3-note hum she'd used at the fairgrounds, and gradually felt his breathing slow beneath her palm. "What happened?" she murmured, more to herself than to him, casting the lantern light around the small stable. "What did he do to you?" Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. The hay was undisturbed, the feed bin closed. It was only when she checked his water trough, out of pure habit, born from years of her father's careful routines, that she noticed the faint, unfamiliar smell rising from the surface, something bitter beneath the usual scent of well water, sharp enough to make her nose wrinkle. She did not touch it. She set the lantern on the shelf and stood very still, understanding beginning to settle over her with cold, creeping certainty. Someone had been here. Someone had come in the dead of night, into her stable, near a horse everyone in the county claimed was too dangerous to approach without training and firm authority, which meant whoever it was either had no fear of Zephyrus at all or knew him well enough not to be afraid. She thought immediately of Thaddeus. She pushed the thought aside for the moment, too shaken and too tired to trust her own suspicions in the dark, and instead turned her attention to Zephyrus's saddle, hanging on its rack near the tack room door, exactly where she'd left it. She ran her hands along the girth strap out of pure instinct, the same careful inspection her father had drilled into her before every ride, checking stitching and buckle and leather for wear. Her fingers found the cut before her eyes did. It ran along the underside of the girth, close to the buckle where the strain would be greatest under a rider's weight, cut clean and deliberate with something sharp rather than worn through by age or use. Had she saddled him tomorrow without checking? Had she mounted for a hard canter or a sudden halt at Highfield in front of half the county's gentry, the strap would very likely have given way entirely, sending her to the ground and Zephyrus into a panic that would have confirmed every terrible thing anyone had ever said about him. Her hands began to shake, not from fear now, but from a slow, rising anger she hadn't felt in years. "He wasn't trying to hurt you," she said quietly to Zephyrus, who had settled enough to lower his head and lip gently at her sleeve. "He was trying to ruin us both and make it look like an accident." She spent the rest of that night awake in the stable, lantern burning low, sitting on an overturned crate near Zephyrus's stall with her father's old riding crop across her knees. Not for use, she admitted to herself, but simply for the comfort of having something solid in her hands. She thought of Thaddeus's face in the village square, the barely concealed fear beneath his contempt, and understood now with clear, cold certainty precisely what he had been afraid of all along. Not that Zephyrus would hurt her, that she would prove him right about nothing at all, and prove herself, and her father before her, right about everything. By the time gray dawn crept through the stable's single window, she had made her decision. She would not go to the Duke with unproven suspicion. Not yet. Not without evidence he couldn't dismiss as village rivalry or a nervous girl's imagination. She would simply be more careful, watch more closely, and make certain that whoever had come in the night would not have a second chance to finish what they'd started. Highfield was still 4 days away. She intended to arrive there with a horse fully sound, a saddle fully trustworthy, and a truth she meant to see proven in front of every witness who mattered, whatever it cost her to get there. Dawn broke pale and cold over Keldon, and Siobhan used its first gray light to finish what the darkness had only allowed her to begin. She had not slept again after her long vigil on the overturned crate, but exhaustion had given way to a clear, purposeful focus that carried her through the morning's work. She started with the water trough, tipping the tainted contents out onto the far side of the yard, where Zephyrus would have no cause to wander, well away from the chickens who pecked at anything within reach. She scrubbed the trough twice with sand and fresh well water before refilling it, unwilling to trust even a lingering trace of whatever bitter substance had been mixed in during the night. She did not know what it was. Some irritant meant to unsettle his stomach or cloud his mind, she guessed, something subtle enough to pass for illness rather than obvious tampering, which told her whoever had done this understood horses well enough to disguise their cruelty as misfortune. The girth strap required more careful attention. She examined the cut again in full daylight, tracing its clean edge with her thumb, and confirmed what she'd already suspected in the dark. No fraying, no natural wear, simply a deliberate slice, made with a sharp blade close enough to the buckle that the damage would have gone unnoticed until weight and motion finished the work. She could have replaced the strap entirely. She had a spare in the tack room, older and slightly stiffer but sound. Instead, she chose to repair it, binding the cut section with heavy waxed cord in a technique her father had taught her for emergency mends on the road, wrapping and knotting it until the strap held firm under a hard tug. It was not elegant. It would not have passed inspection by a saddler's critical eye, but it would hold, and more importantly, it meant she would not need to explain to anyone, not yet, why her equipment required sudden, unexplained replacement so close to the exhibition. "You're not getting rid of us that easily," she murmured, tightening the last knot with more force than strictly necessary. She fed Zephyrus fresh oats from a sealed sack she'd kept locked in the cottage rather than the stable, and watched him eat with careful attention, relieved when he showed no sign of the sluggishness or discomfort that tainted feed might have caused had he consumed any before her discovery. Whatever had been slipped into his water, it seemed he'd drunk little enough of it before his own instincts, sharper than any human's, had warned him something was wrong. Which explained, She realized now, the scream that had woken her in the first place. He had not been attacked. He had smelled the danger himself and cried out against it, exactly as any sensible creature would. The thought settled something uneasy in her chest. Whatever Thaddeus, if it had indeed been Thaddeus, though she still lacked proof enough to name him aloud with confidence, had hoped to accomplish, Zephyrus's own good sense had undone the worst of it before real harm could be done. She spent the remainder of the morning working him gently through familiar exercises, unwilling to push him hard after the fright of the night before, content instead to let him graze in the paddock while she sat nearby, mending the loose stitching along an old saddle blanket and turning the situation over in her mind. Going to the Duke with suspicion alone would accomplish little. She had no witness beyond a fleeing shadow in poor lantern light, no proof beyond a cut strap she'd already repaired, and a smell that had long since faded from the trough she'd scrubbed clean. Worse, accusing the Duke's own head trainer of sabotage without solid evidence risked branding her as exactly the kind of hysterical, ungrateful upstart Thaddeus had painted her as in the village square. A girl who couldn't manage a difficult horse or a difficult situation without crying foul at every turn. No, she would say nothing yet. She would simply be more careful. She began sleeping in the stable itself from that night forward, a blanket and pillow arranged on a bed of clean straw near Zephyrus's stall, close enough that any disturbance would wake her instantly. She checked every strap and buckle twice before each ride, examined every bucket of water and scoop of feed before it reached him, and kept her father's old crop within reach at all times, more talisman now than tool. Zephyrus seemed to understand, in whatever way horses understood such things, that the world beyond their small stable had grown more dangerous. He grew, if anything, more attentive to her in the days that followed, nickering softly whenever she entered the stable and pressing close against her shoulder in a way he hadn't done even in their earliest gentle mornings together. 4 days, she told him on the 12th night, running a brush along his flank by lamplight while the wind moved through the thatched roof overhead. 4 days. And then we prove every last one of them wrong. Or we don't. But either way, nobody's taking you from me again without a fight. He turned his great head toward her at the sound of her voice, dark eyes calm and steady in the lamplight, and Siobhan allowed herself, for the first time since the night of the scream, a small, tired smile. Whatever waited for them at Highfield, she intended to arrive prepared, for the exhibition and for whatever else Thaddeus might still have planned before they got there. The last 3 days before Highfield passed without further incident, though Siobhan trusted the calm no more than she trusted a still sky before a storm. She kept her guard up through every feeding, every grooming session, every quiet hour spent working Zephyrus through the movements she hoped would carry them through whatever the exhibition demanded. By the morning of the 14th day, when she finally led him out of the stable and onto the road toward Highfield, she felt as prepared as she was ever likely to feel, which was to say, not entirely, but enough to try. The journey took most of the morning, Zephyrus walking steadily beside her borrowed cart, lent, grudgingly, by a neighboring farmer in exchange for a week's mending work she'd promised once the exhibition was behind her, his coat brushed to a deep, gleaming bay and his mane carefully plaited the way her father used to plait the coats of horses meant for show. She had scrubbed her own single good dress until the fabric nearly wore thin, mended the hem twice, and pinned her hair back as neatly as her limited skill allowed. It would have to do. She had no illusions about competing with the silks and velvets she expected to find among Highfield's gathered gentry. The equestrian pavilion rose into view well before she reached it, a sprawling arrangement of striped canvas tents and timber grandstands erected specifically for the occasion, already thick with carriages and liveried grooms, and the particular bustle of an event that drew half the county's notable families under one roof. Flags snapped in the autumn wind above the main arena, and the smell of fresh sawdust and trampled grass hung thick over everything. Heads turned as she led Zephyrus through the outer gate. She had expected curiosity, given the horse's reputation, but the reaction that met her was something closer to open disbelief. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A cluster of well-dressed women near the refreshment tent stopped fanning themselves entirely, watching with undisguised astonishment as the supposedly dangerous stallion walked calmly past a row of unfamiliar horses and skittish carriage teams without so much as a flattened ear. A young stable boy dropped the bucket he was carrying, water splashing across his boots, too transfixed by the sight to notice his own clumsiness. "That's never the Aldenford horse," she heard someone murmur behind her. "The one that broke Ferris's arm? Can't be. Look how he walks, quiet as a plow horse." Siobhan kept her chin level and her pace steady, refusing to let the whispers unsettle either herself or Zephyrus, who seemed, if anything, more curious than nervous about the noise and color surrounding them. She led him toward the temporary stabling arranged along the pavilion's eastern side, found the stall marked with her name on a scrap of paper pinned to the door, and set about the familiar, grounding work of settling him in. Fresh water checked twice before she allowed him near it, hay laid out, girth and tack inspected once more, despite having done so already that morning. She had barely finished when she felt eyes on her from across the row of stalls. Thaddeus stood near the entrance to the Duke's private section of stabling, arms folded, his expression carved into careful neutrality that did nothing to disguise the tension coiled beneath it. He did not approach. He simply watched, and Siobhan understood, meeting his gaze briefly before turning back to her work, that he had expected, perhaps counted on, the sabotage from 11 nights before to have already ended her involvement in today's proceedings entirely. Whatever he'd hoped for, it clearly hadn't come to pass, and the flicker of something uneasy behind his composed expression told her he knew it. She busied herself the remainder of the morning with small, careful tasks, walking Zephyrus in slow circles near the temporary paddock, to help him grow accustomed to the noise and movement of the gathering crowd, checking the schedule posted near the main arena entrance to confirm her allotted time that afternoon, and doing her best to ignore the increasingly pointed stares of Highfield's assembled gentry as word of the horse's presence spread through the grounds. By midday, a small crowd had gathered simply to watch her work him through basic exercises near the paddock rail, murmuring among themselves at how readily he responded to her quiet commands. She caught snatches of conversation as she passed, questions about her methods, her training, the strange soft noseband he wore in place of a proper bit, and answered what she could without pausing her work, unwilling to let curiosity distract either of them from the far greater test still ahead. She spotted the Duke himself once during the afternoon, standing near his private viewing box with several other gentlemen, his attention divided between their conversation and occasional glances toward her stall that he did not trouble to disguise. He did not approach. She understood, without needing to be told, that whatever judgment he'd already begun forming about the wisdom of his challenge, he intended to reserve it entirely for what happened in the arena itself. As the afternoon light began its slow slide toward gold, Siobhan led Zephyrus toward the mounting area near the main arena, her stomach tight with nerves she'd managed to keep mostly at bay through the long morning of preparation. Somewhere beyond the canvas walls, she could hear the crowd settling into the grandstands, the low murmur of hundreds of voices anticipating whatever spectacle the afternoon's program had promised them. She checked the girth one final time, fingers finding the careful knot of waxed cord still holding firm beneath the leather, and allowed herself a brief, steadying breath. Whatever Thaddeus had hoped to prevent by sabotaging her equipment 11 nights before, it seemed he would now have no choice but to watch it fail, standing among the very crowd he'd hoped would never see this moment at all. The mounting block stood at the edge of the main arena, a simple wooden platform worn smooth by years of use, and Siobhan led Zephyrus toward it, with her heart beating hard against her ribs. Beyond the canvas partition separating the preparation area from the arena proper, she could hear Pruitt's voice, the same estate manager from the fairground auction, apparently pressed into service again as announcer for the day's proceedings, calling the crowd to order in preparation for the next demonstration. She had perhaps 10 minutes before her name was called. She used them to check everything one final time, though her hands had checked it all so often that morning the motions had become more ritual than necessity. Girth, stirrup leathers, the soft noseband settled correctly against Zephyrus's jaw. Her father's old wool coat had proven too warm for the mild afternoon, and she'd shed it an hour before in favor of her plainer riding jacket, the only garment she owned suited to the work ahead. As she adjusted the collar, settling it properly against her throat, her fingers brushed against something small and cold, pinned near the lapel, a piece she'd nearly forgotten she was wearing at all. The crest pin had belonged to her father. She had found it years ago among his few remaining possessions after his dismissal from Aldenford, tucked into a small wooden box alongside letters she'd never had the courage to read in full, and had taken to wearing it pinned inside her collar where it stayed mostly hidden, a private comfort rather than any statement she'd intended for public view. It was old bronze, worn smooth with age, bearing a small emblem of crossed riding crops beneath a horse's head in profile, a symbol, she'd always understood vaguely, of some honor bestowed on Aldenford's most trusted horseman, though her father had rarely spoken of its meaning, and she had never thought to ask more. She straightened her collar without thinking, and the pin caught the afternoon light, glinting briefly and visibly above the plain wool of her jacket. She did not notice, in that moment, that the Duke's carriage stood positioned near enough to the mounting area to offer him a clear view of the small platform where she now waited. She did not see him lean forward slightly in his seat, nor see the sudden stillness that overtook his features as his gaze fixed on the small glint of bronze at her throat. It was Pruitt's call of her name that finally drew her attention back to the arena, and she gathered Zephyrus's reins, murmured a final steadying word to him, and led him toward the mounting block without any awareness of the quiet upheaval her simple, unthinking gesture had caused several yards away. The Duke of Aldenford sat very still in his carriage, one gloved hand gripping the edge of the door with sudden, forgotten intensity. He knew that crest. He had not seen it in over a decade, had in fact believed every remaining piece bearing that particular mark had either been destroyed or lost entirely, following the scandal that ended his former master of horses' employment so abruptly and so bitterly all those years ago. The pin had been a personal gift, he remembered now with startling clarity, commissioned by his own father, the previous Duke, and awarded to exactly one man in recognition of a lifetime spent perfecting the very technique he had watched a stranger's daughter demonstrate flawlessly across his own estate boundary only a week before. Corwin. The name surfaced from somewhere he had not allowed himself to visit in years, tangled up with old accusations he had never fully investigated, old rumors of theft and misconduct that had seemed, at the time, sufficient grounds for immediate dismissal, delivered by advisors he had trusted, perhaps more than he should have. He remembered, with a discomfort that settled heavy in his chest, how quickly the matter had been closed, how little inquiry had actually been made before a man who'd served the estate faithfully for decades was sent away in disgrace, his name struck from every record the family kept. He had never learned what became of Corwin afterward. He had, if he was honest with himself now, never troubled to ask. "Your Grace?" One of his companions in the carriage box glanced at him, noting his sudden pallor. "Are you unwell?" "Quite well," the Duke said, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Quite well," simply, recalling something I'd nearly forgotten. He watched, with an entirely new and uneasy attention, as Siobhan settled into the saddle at the mounting block, her posture straight, her hands steady on the reins, despite whatever nerves she must surely be feeling before such a crowd. He thought of her words at the estate boundary a week before, spoken with quiet, unshakable confidence. My father trained horses for this estate himself, and felt the full weight of what he had failed, at the time, to properly hear. She had not simply purchased a difficult horse and tamed him through unusual patience and skill. She had, in all likelihood, inherited a method, a legacy, that his own family had cast out of Aldenford's stables through hasty judgment and insufficient investigation, only to watch it return now, uninvited and entirely unrecognized, wearing his own father's forgotten crest. The realization sat uncomfortably alongside his earlier skepticism, his earlier pride, the challenge he'd issued half out of curiosity and half out of wounded vanity at having his own trainer's competence questioned by village gossip. He had meant to prove her wrong today, he admitted to himself now, watching her gather Zephyrus beneath her with easy, practiced confidence. He had not, until this exact moment, considered seriously what it might mean if she proved instead to be entirely, undeniably right. Beyond the arena's canvas walls, Pruitt's voice rose again, calling the crowd's attention toward the main ring, and the Duke of Aldenford settled back into his seat with a strange, unfamiliar unease settling over him. The particular discomfort of a man beginning to suspect he had wronged someone badly, years before he'd even known there was a debt to be paid, and that the reckoning for it might now be riding directly toward him across his own exhibition grounds. The arena stretched wide before her, ringed by grandstands packed with spectators, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across freshly raked sand. Siobhan felt the weight of every watching eye settle over her the moment she guided Zephyrus through the entrance gate, but she kept her attention fixed forward, exactly as her father had taught her. A horse feels a rider's nerves before the rider even admits to feeling them. "Just us," she murmured, low enough that only Zephyrus's ears caught the sound, swiveling back toward her voice. "Same as Bramblewood. Same as every morning," Pruitt's voice carried across the grounds, announcing her name, and with visible reluctance, the horse's reputation, framing the demonstration as either a remarkable achievement or an imminent disaster, depending on how the next several minutes unfolded. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd, punctuated by murmurs she chose not to listen to closely. She asked Zephyrus for a walk first, letting him settle into the rhythm of the space, acclimating to the sand beneath his hooves and the sheer size of the arena compared to anything he'd worked in before. He moved forward with calm, measured steps, ears attentive but untroubled, and she felt some of the tension in her own shoulders begin to ease in response to his steadiness. She built the sequence slowly, exactly as she'd planned through countless hours of practice, a smooth transition into trot, wide sweeping circles that showed off the balanced, self-collected gait she'd discovered by accident in Bramblewood's clearing. figures that required precise coordination between horse and rider without a single harsh correction or raised hand. Zephyrus answered every request before she'd fully finished asking it, as though he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly this kind of conversation. The crowd's murmuring shifted somewhere during the third circuit, disbelief giving way to something closer to fascination. She caught glimpses of faces along the rail, mouths slightly open, heads tilted in genuine astonishment, but kept her focus narrowed entirely to the horse beneath her and the sequence still ahead. She asked for the canter next, and felt the same extraordinary cadence she'd discovered days before roll beneath her like a wave, finding its natural shape, powerful and controlled in equal measure. She guided him through a wide serpentine across the width of the arena, his changes of direction smooth enough that she barely needed to shift her weight before he'd already anticipated the request. From his private box, the Duke watched in absolute silence, one hand still resting against the carriage door where he'd gripped it since recognizing the crest pin at her collar. Beside him, Thaddeus stood rigid, his earlier composure entirely abandoned, his eyes fixed on the arena with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. He had expected, Siobhan realized later when she learned the full account of that afternoon, that whatever fear or unfamiliarity the grand space provoked in Zephyrus would surface eventually, confirming everything he'd insisted about the horse's true nature. It did not come. There was nothing left in the animal's movement that resembled the panicked, dangerous creature he'd once claimed to know better than anyone. She brought Zephyrus down to a walk near the center of the arena and asked, finally, for the side pass, the movement she'd shown the Duke at the estate boundary, the one that had first cracked his certainty about what she and this horse together might actually be capable of. Zephyrus stepped sideways in flawless, unhurried rhythm, crossing the width of the ring with a precision that drew an audible gasp from somewhere in the grandstands. She finished with a slow, deliberate halt directly before the Duke's viewing box, Zephyrus standing perfectly square, ears forward, utterly composed despite the crowd's building excitement around them. For a long moment, silence held the arena. Then the applause began, scattered at first and then building into something thunderous, spreading through the grandstands until the sound seemed to fill the entire pavilion grounds. Siobhan sat very still in the saddle, breathing hard, hardly daring to trust what she was hearing, while Zephyrus stood beneath her with his head high, seemingly unbothered by the roar of noise that would have sent him rearing in terror only weeks before. She glanced toward the Duke's box and found him rising slowly from his seat, his expression unreadable at that distance, but his posture carrying none of the guarded skepticism he'd shown her at the estate boundary. Beside him, Thaddeus had gone pale, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away, and though she couldn't hear his words from where she sat, she watched him lean toward the Duke with visible urgency, gesturing toward the arena as though still attempting, even now, to salvage some version of the argument he'd been making since the day of the fairground auction. Whatever he said, the Duke did not appear to be listening. His attention remained fixed entirely on Siobhan and the horse standing calm and magnificent before him, and something in his expression, even from this distance, looked less like a man watching a successful demonstration and more like a man confronting a debt he had not known he owed. She dismounted slowly once the applause began to settle, keeping one hand on Zephyrus's neck as grooms and estate officials began moving toward the arena, and allowed herself, finally, a single unguarded breath of relief. Whatever came next, whatever conversation waited for her once she was called before the Duke properly, whatever consequences Thaddeus might still attempt to arrange in the aftermath of his failed sabotage, she understood now, standing in the center of that arena, with the applause still ringing around her, that nothing anyone said afterward could undo what several hundred witnesses had just seen with their own eyes. The horse everyone called impossible had proven, beyond any argument, exactly the opposite. And somewhere beneath that plain truth, unspoken but unmistakable in the Duke's stricken expression, lay the beginning of a much older story, finally working its way back into the light. The summons arrived the following morning, carried by a groom on horseback, who informed her, with careful formality, that the Duke of Aldenford requested her presence at the manor house before noon. Siobhan, dressed in her mended good dress once more, left Zephyrus in the temporary stabling under the watchful eye of a groom she'd come to trust over the previous day's chaos, and made the journey to Aldenford Manor with her stomach in knots the entire way. She had never set foot inside the great house before, though her father must have walked its halls 1,000 times in his years of service. The drawing room she was shown into was grand in a way that made her acutely conscious of her worn hem and work-roughened hands, all dark wood paneling and tall windows overlooking manicured grounds, portraits of past dukes, watching from gilded frames along the walls. The Duke stood near the window when she entered, and turned to face her with an expression far different from the guarded skepticism he'd worn at their first meeting. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the night wrestling with something uncomfortable and had not entirely won. Miss Siobhan. He gestured toward a chair, though she remained standing, too unsettled to sit comfortably in a room so far removed from anything she knew. I owe you an explanation, and I suspect several apologies besides. Your Grace, I only came to demonstrate what I told you I could. You demonstrated a great deal more than that. He crossed to a small writing desk near the window and lifted a folded paper from its surface, though he did not yet hand it to her. The pin at your collar yesterday, it belonged to a man named Corwin, did it not? My father's former master of horse. Siobhan felt the room tilt slightly beneath her. She had not spoken her father's name aloud to him, had guarded it carefully through every previous meeting, uncertain how the mention of it might be received in a house that had cast him out so completely. My father, she said quietly. Yes, Your Grace. The Duke's shoulders dropped, some tension leaving him that she hadn't fully registered until it was gone. I remember him, though I was little more than a boy when he left this estate. I remember, too, that the circumstances of his dismissal were never properly explained to me, only presented as settled fact by advisers I trusted, perhaps more than I should have. Theft, they claimed. Missing funds from the stable accounts, though I confess I never saw the ledgers myself, nor questioned why the matter was resolved so swiftly and so quietly. He never stole anything, Siobhan said, and heard her own voice shake slightly, despite her effort to keep it steady. He spent every night of my life insisting on that, long after most people in Oakhaven had stopped listening. I believe you. The Duke's admission came simply, without hesitation, and something in Siobhan's chest ached at how easily the words landed, after years of watching her father carry the weight of an accusation nobody had ever properly examined. Last night, I had my steward pull the old estate records from that period. It took some searching, but we found what I suspected we might: discrepancies in the stable accounts dating from well before your father's dismissal, discrepancies that continued, in fact, for several years after he'd already gone. Discrepancies that align, troublingly closely, with a man who was promoted into your father's position almost immediately following his removal. Siobhan's breath caught. Ah, Dias. Mr. Thaddeus's employment with this estate ended this morning, the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly, along with a formal inquiry into the missing funds and a rather more urgent conversation regarding a damaged girth strap and a fouled water trough 11 nights ago, which I understand you chose not to report to me directly, though I suspect I now understand why. I had no proof, Your Grace. Only suspicion. You had considerably more sense than most in your position would have managed, given the circumstances. He set the folded paper down at last, on the small table between them, and Siobhan saw it bore an official seal, dense lines of formal script covering its surface. This restores your father's name to the estate records, cleared of any wrongdoing, with a formal acknowledgement of the injustice done to him. I cannot undo the years he lost, nor the reputation he was forced to carry, through no fault of his own. I can, at least, ensure the truth stands where the accusation once did. Siobhan pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, unable to speak for a moment, thinking of her father's quiet grief in the years before his death, the way he'd never once stopped loving horses, despite everything the accusation had cost him. "There is one further matter," the Duke continued, allowing her a moment to gather herself before pressing on. "Aldenford stables have been without a proper master of horse in all but name since your father's departure. Mr. Thaddeus's methods, I now understand far better than I did a fortnight ago, produced obedience through fear rather than trust, and cost this estate more in ruined animals and damaged reputation than I'd allowed myself to properly consider." He met her eyes directly. "I would like to offer you that position, Master of Horse, for the entirety of the Aldenford estate, with full authority over training and breeding practices going forward." Siobhan stared at him, certain for a moment she had misheard entirely. "Your Grace, I'm a woman of 25, with no formal position anywhere, and no name beyond what you've just restored to me. You are the daughter of the finest horseman this estate has ever employed, and you have proven, in the space of 2 weeks, more skill and integrity than the man I paid handsomely to replace him for over a decade." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him. "I find myself disinclined to let good sense stand in the way of good judgment any longer than it already has." Siobhan thought of Zephyrus, calm and gleaming in his temporary stall, of the £5 she'd handed over without hesitation weeks before, of her father's patient voice, teaching her the quiet way beneath a paddock fence long since fallen into disrepair. "Then I accept, Your Grace," she said, and felt something long broken finally begin, quietly and completely, to mend.